I suppose I should start with my name, Daniel Harper. I work as a field investigator for the National Park Service, which is a fancy way of saying I get called in when hikers go missing, when things don't add up, or when something strange happens deep in the backcountry. This is one of those cases. One that still gnaws at me. One I can't explain. It happened in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, somewhere between Clingman's Dome and Forney Ridge. The report came in on October 14, 2022, from a man named Ben Calloway. His sister, Julia Calloway, had gone missing while hiking alone. He'd been waiting for her at their rental cabin in Gatlinburg, expecting her back by nightfall. When she didn't return, he called us. Julia was 35 years old, an experienced hiker. She'd done the Appalachian Trail years ago, spent months outdoors. She knew the risks, carried supplies, wasn't the type to just wander off a marked trail. She had texted her brother around 11:30 a.m., saying she had reached Andrews Bald and was taking in the view. That was the last anyone heard from her. By the time I got involved, 48 hours had passed. The rangers had already combed the main trails, sent out volunteer search teams, even used a helicopter when the weather permitted. Nothing. No tracks, no drop gear, not a single clue. There was something about this one that felt different. I've dealt with missing hikers before. Over 1,600 people have disappeared in U.S. national parks under unexplained circumstances, but this case had an absence. A complete lack of evidence. No struggle, no signs of distress. Just gone. I got my gear, took a few rangers with me, and we set out on a new grid search along Forney Ridge Trail. I had a strange feeling right away. The woods were silent. Too silent. No birds, no wind rustling the trees, nothing. Just the sound of our boots crunching over fallen leaves. Then we found her footprints. They led off trail. Not in a frantic way, not like she was lost. Just a single set of tracks, heading deeper into the forest, away from the established paths. The odd thing? The prints were perfectly spaced. No sign of stumbling, no hesitation. As if she'd walked with purpose. We followed them for almost a mile, weaving between trees, until they just stopped. Vanished. No drag marks, no indication she turned around. Just a final footprint pressed into the damp earth, and then, nothing. I've never seen anything like that before. It sent a shiver up my spine. People don't just disappear mid-step. I called out, my voice echoing uselessly between the trees. Nothing. The air felt thick, heavy. One of the rangers muttered something about the missing 411 cases, the stories about people vanishing in national parks under bizarre circumstances. I didn't want to think about that. I wanted a logical answer. There had to be one. Then we heard it. A whistle. High-pitched, distant, yet strangely close. It wasn't a bird, wasn't wind, it was too distinct. 3 notes. The same pattern, repeated. One of the rangers, Carter, went pale. That's the same damn sound people report before they go missing, he muttered. I was about to tell him to shut up when we heard footsteps. Not ours. Something moving nearby, just beyond the trees. But no figure, no movement. Just the sound of someone walking. The moment stretched into something unnatural. Carter whispered, "We shouldn't be here." That was why I saw something hanging from a branch ahead. A red bandana, tied in a simple knot. Julia's? Maybe. It wasn't faded, not like it had been out in the elements for long. I reached up to grab it, and as soon as my fingers touched the fabric, the whistling stopped. Dead silence. And then, something whispered my name. That was when we left. Fast. When we got back to base, I checked with Julia's brother. She didn't own a red bandana. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the ranger station with a cup of bad coffee, staring at the bandana we'd found. It sat on my desk, harmless. Just a piece of cloth. But I knew something wasn't right. I'd been in these woods too long to ignore my instincts. I checked the search logs again, the reports filed by other teams. The weather had been clear. No dangerous wildlife encounters. No signs of a struggle. Just nothing. The way the print stopped was what haunted me. I called Julia's brother, Ben, again. Did she ever mention hearing anything weird on the trails? Whistling? Voices? He hesitated. Why? Just tell me. Ben exhaled. She said something about it a couple days before she left. She thought she kept hearing someone whistling when she was hiking near Cade's Cove, but every time she turned around, no one was there. Said it sounded wrong. Like it wasn't coming from a person. My gut twisted. I knew that sound. Carter, the ranger who had been with me earlier, walked into the station. He looked like hell, dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept either. He sat down across from me. I looked into something last night, he muttered. You're not gonna like it. He slid an old missing persons report across the table. The case was from 1986. A hiker, Eleanor Finch, had disappeared on the exact same ridge as Julia. Same time of year. Same circumstances. No body, no trace. Just gone. Then he pulled out another file. 1999, another missing hiker. Samuel Ridgway. Vanished along Forney Ridge Trail. No remains ever found. No evidence. And then another case. 2007, a boy, Ethan Marshall, age 10, who had wandered off from a family campsite. Search teams found his footprints leading away from the site, but they stopped in the exact same way Julia's did. The boy was never found. Carter ran a hand over his face. 3 cases in the same area. All with footprints that just stopped. All with reports of whistling before they went missing. He tapped the table. And then there's this. He flipped the file open to the last search log from Ethan Marshall's case. It mentioned an object found at the scene. A red bandana. A chill crawled up my spine. We went back out at first light. This time, it was just Carter and me. The other rangers didn't want to touch this case anymore. We retraced our steps to where we had found Julia's last footprint, to where the forest felt too quiet. The place felt wrong. Like stepping into the eye of a storm. Then we saw something new. More footprints. But these weren't Julia's. These were barefoot. Small. Leading away from where we had been yesterday. My throat went dry. Carter, I said, pointing. His face drained of color. Those weren't there before. We followed them. Step by step. Each print deep, deliberate. The kind made by something that knew exactly where it was going. They led us down into a rocky outcrop, past a tangle of twisted tree roots and slick moss-covered stones. And then, they disappeared. Again. But this time, we weren't alone. Somewhere in the trees, something shifted. A shape just beyond the branches. Watching. Then came the whistle. 3 notes. Clear. Close. Carter's breathing turned ragged. We need to leave. Now. I agreed. We turned back, fast. As we reached the main trail, I dared one last look behind me. Something stood at the tree line. A figure, tall and still, partially obscured by the trunks. Watching. It didn't move. It didn't have to. Because I knew, deep in my bones, it was waiting. We didn't talk on the way back. Neither of us wanted to say it out loud, what we had seen. What we both knew was real. When we reached the ranger station, Carter went straight to his truck and drove off without a word. I didn't blame him. I sat at my desk, staring at the footage from my body cam. I had turned it on the second we saw the footprints. My hands were clammy as I scrolled through the video, pausing at the moment when we heard the whistle. The sound was crystal clear. 3 notes, distinct, too perfect. I turned up the volume, listening carefully. Something chilled me to my core. After the 3rd note faded, there was a pause. And then, a voice. One word. Soft, almost curious. Daniel. I slammed the laptop shut. My heart hammered in my chest. There was no way. No way in hell. I hadn't heard that in the moment. But it was there. My name, spoken in a tone that sounded both human and not human. A knock on my door made me jolt. Ben Calloway stood outside, eyes bloodshot, face hollow. "Any news?" he asked. His voice was raw, like he hadn't slept. I opened my mouth. I should have told him no. I should have said, "We're still looking. We'll find her." But instead, I hesitated. He noticed. "You found something." I exhaled. "Not exactly." I reached for the red bandana and handed it to him. "We found this near where her footprints stopped." "Are you sure Julia never had one like this?" Ben turned it over in his hands. Then, slowly, his face paled. "No. She didn't." He swallowed hard. "But I've seen this before." I leaned in. "Where?" He hesitated, as if debating whether to tell me. Finally, he said, "In my dream." I stared at him. "Your dream?" Ben let out a shaky breath. "Last night. I dreamt I was in the woods, and Julia was there. She was standing between the trees, far away. I called to her, but she wouldn't move. She just looked at me." He clenched the bandana in his fist. "She was holding this." My stomach twisted. "What else?" Ben shook his head. "That's the thing." I tried to step toward her, but the second I did, everything changed. The trees stretched tall, too tall, like the forest had swallowed the sky. And then, he licked his lips, as if afraid to say it. Something whistled. And I woke up. Silence. I didn't know what to say. I'd heard of weird coincidences before, but this was something else. Before I could respond, the radio crackled. "Base, this is Carter. I need backup. I'm back at the site. There's something here." His voice was strained, on the edge of panic. I grabbed the radio. "Carter, what the hell are you doing back there?" Static. Then, another whistle. 3 notes. And then, in the background of Carter's transmission, came footsteps. Not his. Something was walking toward him. Then the radio cut out. I grabbed my pack and ran. I ran as fast as I could, my boots hammering against the damp earth, breath burning in my lungs, heart pounding in my ears as the trees blurred past me. The ridge trail twisted ahead, miscurling around the trunks like ghostly fingers, and I knew I was making a mistake, but I couldn't stop. The radio transmission had been clear. Carter was out there, alone, with something approaching him, and I couldn't leave him behind. Ben was close behind me, barely keeping up, and I cursed myself for not forcing him to stay back. But when he had looked at me and said, "If Julia's still out there, I'm not waiting around," I had known there was no stopping him. The silence in the forest had returned, that awful, suffocating stillness that swallowed every sound except our footfalls and the ragged gasps of breath between them. No wind through the leaves. No birds. Nothing natural. It felt as if we were running deeper into something unnatural, like stepping across an unseen threshold into a place that had been waiting for us all along. Every instinct screamed for me to turn back, but I pushed forward, my fingers gripping the radio in my vest as I called out, "Carter, do you copy?" The radio hissed with static, then cut to silence. We reached the clearing, the same spot where Julia's footprints had stopped, where we had found the red bandana. But now, something else was there. A radio. It lay in the dirt, half buried, the same model we all carried. Carter's. My stomach dropped as Ben lunged forward, grabbing it with shaking hands, pressing the button. "Carter?" "It's Ben. Do you copy?" Static at first, then something else. A whisper. Soft, distant, almost thoughtful. Not Carter. Not Julia. Something else entirely. I scanned the trees, every muscle in my body tense for movement, for an answer, for any sign of Carter. My voice was hoarse as I called his name, but something was wrong. My voice felt swallowed, dampened by the trees, as if the forest had absorbed the sound before it could travel. There should have been an echo, but there wasn't. Then I saw her. A figure stood just beyond the tree line, barely visible between the trunks. Ben inhaled sharply, his voice breaking as he whispered, He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Julia. Or at least, it looked like her. She was standing there, wearing the same hiking clothes she had been reported missing in, but something was wrong. Her posture was too stiff, too still, her arms hanging unnaturally at her sides. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and unmoving. She wasn't blinking. She wasn't breathing. She was just there. Ben's voice cracked as he stepped forward, reaching toward her, but I grabbed his arm, tightening my grip. Wait. My pulse was a hammer against my ribs. She hadn't moved. Not once. Not even to react to her brother's voice. Then, slowly, she lifted one hand. She pointed. Not at us. Behind us. Ben turned, and I followed his gaze just as it came, the whistle. 3 sharp notes, too close, too clear. My body seized with cold dread as I spun around. And that was when I saw it. It wasn't a person. It wasn't Julia. It wasn't human. The thing standing between the trees was tall, too tall, its limbs stretched unnaturally, its body wrong, as if it had been stitched together from pieces that didn't belong. Its head didn't match its torso, its arms hung too long at its sides, its fingers twitching slightly. The worst part was the face, empty sockets where eyes should have been, a hollow gaze that didn't need to see to know exactly where we were. And then, as if it knew what we were thinking, as if it understood what fear tasted like, it smiled. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed Ben's arm and yanked him backward, my voice breaking as I shouted, "Run!" We ran, branches slashing at my face, my boots skidding on wet leaves as we bolted down the trail, but the whistling followed. Mocking. Keeping pace. The trees rushed past in a blur, but no matter how fast we ran, it felt like something was right behind us, just beyond sight, waiting for us to fall, waiting for us to stumble. We didn't stop. Not when we reached the ranger station, not when we threw ourselves inside and locked the door, our chests heaving, our hands shaking. Ben collapsed against the wall, gasping, his face drenched in sweat. What? His voice failed him, his body trembling as his mind tried to process what we had just seen. I grabbed the radio with a shaking hand. "Carter," I called, my voice barely steady. "Carter, do you copy?" Silence. Then, from the other side of the door, came the sound I had been dreading. A whistle. 3 notes. It had followed us home. Ben stood against the wall, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts, his hands clenched into fists as though trying to steady himself. He looked like he was on the verge of collapse, and truth be told, I wasn't far behind him. My own hands trembled as I gripped the radio, staring at the door, listening, straining for any sign of movement beyond it. The air in the station felt thick, like it was pressing down on us, the silence growing heavier with every second. I couldn't hear footsteps, couldn't hear anything at all, except for that one sound that wouldn't stop playing in my head, over and over again. The whistle. 3 sharp notes, too clear, too deliberate, too knowing. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person. It was for us. Ben swallowed hard, his eyes flicking toward the windows, scanning the dense forest that pressed in just beyond the tree line. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke, his words slow, uncertain. "You saw it, didn't you?" I nodded, keeping my gaze locked on the door. "Yeah." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, his fingers shaking more than he probably wanted to admit. And that wasn't, his voice trailed off, unable to finish the thought, as if saying it out loud would make it worse. "No," I said before he could continue. "That wasn't Julia." His face twisted, his jaw tightening as if he wanted to argue, wanted to hold on to even the smallest shred of hope, but deep down, he knew. He had seen the way that thing stood between the trees, motionless, staring, too still to be human. He had felt the wrongness of it, the way the air had thickened when it lifted its arm and pointed towards something behind us. That thing had worn Julia's shape, but it hadn't been her. And if it wasn't her, then where the hell was she? A slow, deliberate knock echoed against the wooden door. The blood in my veins turned ice cold. Ben went rigid, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk as though he might collapse if he let go. A second knock followed, louder, more insistent this time, and then the doorknob turned. Ben made a strangled noise in the back of his throat, his whole body recoiling as he pushed himself further into the corner, as though he could somehow make himself disappear into the walls. I took an instinctive step forward, hand reaching for the gun strapped to my belt, but I wasn't sure what good it would do. My fingers curled around the grip, my pulse hammering in my ears, my breath coming too fast. I had never fired at anything except a paper target before. Never had to use it in the field. But this wasn't the kind of situation we had been trained for. Then, from the other side of the door, a voice. Daniel. A chill crawled up my spine, settling deep in my bones. It was Carter's voice. Ben's head jerked toward me, his expression frantic, his mouth forming the words before he even spoke them. That's not him. His whisper was barely audible, but I already knew. My gut had told me the second I heard it. The voice was too flat, too measured, missing that edge of panic, that breathless urgency that should have been there if Carter had really made it back on foot after being lost in the woods. The thing outside wasn't asking for help. It wasn't trying to get inside out of desperation. It was just saying my name. Testing it. I tightened my grip on the gun, forcing my voice to stay level. Carter? I called, keeping my stance firm, trying not to let it show that I was already trembling. A pause. Then, that same voice, empty, even. Yeah. Open the door. Ben was shaking his head violently, and I didn't move. How'd you get back here? I asked, forcing the question out through gritted teeth, buying time, waiting for some kind of tell, something that would confirm what we already knew but didn't want to admit. Another pause, just long enough to send my nerves screaming. Then, in that same unnatural, almost practiced tone, the thing outside said, I walked. My stomach turned. It wasn't trying to convince me. It wasn't pleading, wasn't explaining, wasn't giving any details. It just wanted me to open the door. I inhaled slowly, trying to steady myself, my fingers twitching over the gun's handle. What happened to you, Carter? Another silence. Longer this time. As if whatever was out there was thinking. As if it had to decide what the right answer was. Finally, it spoke again. I got lost. I could hear my own breathing, hear the way my pulse roared in my ears, but beyond that, nothing. No footsteps shifting on the wooden porch, no sound of breath on the other side of the door. Just stillness. Then it knocked again. Once. Twice. 3 times. A slow, deliberate rhythm, not impatient, not angry, just waiting. Like a signal. Like a warning. And then, as suddenly as it had come, it left. I didn't hear it walk away. Didn't hear the crunch of boots on gravel, the rustle of leaves, the sound of branches shifting as it moved through the woods. But somehow, I knew it was gone. Ben let out a long, unsteady breath, his whole body sagging forward as though all the strength had drained out of him at once. His hands gripped his knees, his shoulders rising and falling with every labored inhale. I could still hear the pounding of my own heart, the blood rushing through my head like a drumbeat, my mind trying to process what had just happened. Then, from the radio in my hand, a burst of static, followed by a voice. Bass, this is Carter. My stomach dropped. Ben's head snapped up, his face pale, his eyes locked onto me in stunned silence. My fingers clenched tighter around the radio, my breath caught in my throat. Carter's voice was frantic, breathless, real. Jesus Christ, Daniel, do you copy? I don't know where I am. I think I'm still out here. Static swallowed the last of his words, a jagged distortion that sent a shudder down my spine. Ben's voice came out barely above a whisper. What? Shut up, I hissed, pressing the radio closer to my ear. Carter. Carter, it's me. Where are you? More static. A garbled noise, half a word breaking apart through the interference. Then, the whistle. 3 sharp notes, too precise, too clear. Then Carter's voice again, but this time it was wrong. Warped. Distant. I don't, alone, not me. The transmission cut out completely, leaving only empty static, and then, just before it died altogether, something else came through. A whisper. Not Carter's voice. Something else. Something laughing. A slow, breathy exhale of amusement, quiet, taunting, stretching into the silence, like whatever was on the other end of the radio was watching me, waiting for my reaction. And then, nothing. I sat frozen, the radio clenched in my hand, Carter's broken words still echoing in my ears. My mind was a mess of thoughts, none of them making sense, none of them leading to anything I could explain. The static had cut out completely, leaving only the thick silence of the ranger station, the kind that pressed against my ears and made my skin crawl. Across from me, Ben was shaking, his face pale, his eyes locked on the radio as if it might start speaking again. His breath came in sharp, uneven bursts, and I could tell he was barely keeping himself together. The laugh had been the worst part. It hadn't been Carter's. It hadn't been human. It had been slow, deliberate, filled with something that sent a deep, primal fear through me. I had spent years in these woods, had seen what the wilderness could do to people, how it could turn them around, make them disappear. But this wasn't that. This wasn't natural. This was something else. Something that had been playing with us. Ben was the first to speak. We have to go back. His voice was raw, but there was something behind it, determination, desperation. I knew what he was going to say before he even said it. If Carter's still out there, we have to find him. I wanted to tell him no. Every instinct screamed that going back was a mistake. But then I thought of Carter, his voice cracking with panic, the way he had said, "I think I'm still out here." What did that mean? He wasn't sure. Was he hearing something that made him question where he was? Or worse, what he was? I forced a breath through my nose and stood, my limbs stiff from tension. "We go prepared," I said, my voice low, steady. "Flashlights, weapons, flares. We don't split up. If we see anything," I stopped myself, looking at Ben. "If we see anything, we don't trust it." He swallowed hard, nodding. We moved fast, gathering supplies, extra radios, a satellite phone, knives, and the flares I kept for emergencies. My gun was already strapped to my hip, though after what I had seen, I wasn't sure a bullet would do much against whatever was out there. The entire time we were getting ready, I kept expecting another knock at the door, another voice that wasn't quite right calling my name. But it never came. The forest outside the station remained unnaturally still. We left at first light. The air was cold, damp with the remnants of morning fog that clung low to the ground, curling around our ankles as we hiked back toward the ridge. I kept my radio on, listening for any sign of Carter. The transmission hadn't come from far. He had to be close. I kept telling myself that, kept forcing myself to believe it, because the alternative, the possibility that we weren't looking for Carter at all anymore, was something I wasn't ready to face. The deeper we went, the worse it got. The forest felt wrong, the trees too tall, their trunks stretching up and disappearing into a canopy that let in no light. The trail beneath our feet, once familiar, seemed longer than before, as if the woods had shifted, stretched, made room for us. The silence was heavy, crushing, and the further we walked, the harder it became to shake the feeling that we were being watched. And then, we found footprints. They weren't Julia's. They weren't even Carter's. They were bare. Small. Scattered in different directions, as if someone, or something, had been pacing in the same place for hours. Ben cursed under his breath, stopping short, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "What the hell is this?" He turned in a slow circle, eyes darting between the trees. These weren't here before. I knelt, running my fingers over one of the deeper prints. It was fresh. Too fresh. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. That was when the whistle came. Sharp, clear, 3 notes drifting through the trees from somewhere ahead. I stood fast, my grip tightening on the flashlight. It wasn't just the sound that made my blood run cold, it was the way it echoed. As if it wasn't coming from one direction, but from everywhere. Ben took a step back, shaking his head. This isn't. Then he stopped. His breath hitched. I followed his gaze. And saw Julia. She stood between the trees, half hidden in the mist, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening to something we couldn't hear. Her face was blank, expressionless, her arms limp at her sides. She wasn't moving. She wasn't blinking. Ben sucked in a shaky breath. Julia? She didn't react. Then, slowly, she raised her arm. And pointed. Not at us. At something behind us. The air turned electric. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see what she was looking at. But I did. And the moment I did, the thing standing in the trees, the thing that wasn't Julia, smiled. It was the same wrong shape we had seen before. Too tall. Too thin. Too broken. It shifted slightly, a slow, unnatural movement, and then, as if it had been waiting for us to notice, it took a step forward. The moment its foot touched the ground, the whistle sounded again, louder this time, piercing through the air like a warning. Or a signal. And all around us, in the spaces between the trees, more figures began to appear. Some were tall. Some were small. Some looked like people who had been missing for a very, very long time. None of them moved. Not yet. I grabbed Ben's arm. Run. And the moment we did, the forest came alive. We ran, pushing through the thick, damp air as the forest closed in around us. The ground beneath our feet felt wrong, as if it stretched and shifted with every step, the trees towering higher, their trunks bending in unnatural ways. The silence was gone now, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the deliberate, measured footsteps behind us. They weren't running. They didn't need to. They moved like they had all the time in the world, like they knew exactly where we were going, as if we were following a path they had set for us long before we had arrived. Ben was breathing hard beside me, his steps uneven as panic took hold, his eyes darting from the trees to the ground and back again. This isn't right, he gasped, barely keeping up, his voice raw with fear. The trail, it's different. It wasn't like this before. I didn't respond, because I already knew. The path that should have led back to the station had changed, twisted, forked in places where it never had before. It was as if the forest was shifting around us, reconfiguring itself with every frantic step we took. Then, ahead, we saw them, footprints, scattered across the damp soil. They weren't ours. They weren't Carter's. They were bare. Small. Too small. They crisscrossed in chaotic patterns, moving in different directions, circling back on themselves as if whoever made them had been pacing here for hours. My stomach turned, and I grabbed Ben's arm to keep him from stepping forward. The prints were fresh. They hadn't been here before. Someone, or something, had left them just moments ago. A sharp whistle split through the trees, the same 3-note tune we had been hearing since we arrived. This time, it was followed by more. One from our left, another from our right, another from somewhere ahead. The sound echoed from every direction, too many at once, layered over each other in a distorted chorus. They were calling to each other, responding, closing in. I turned, scanning the trees, my fingers tightening around the handle of the gun at my hip, my heart hammering so hard it felt like my ribs would crack. Then, between the trunks, Julia appeared. She stood completely still, her body half hidden in the mist, her face pale, her expression empty. She didn't blink. She didn't move. She only stared. The air around us seemed to tighten, pressing against my skin as if the forest itself was watching through her hollow gaze. Ben made a strangled sound beside me, stumbling forward before I could stop him. Julia? His voice cracked, caught somewhere between hope and terror. He stepped toward her, but she didn't react, didn't acknowledge him at all. Then, slowly, she raised one arm and pointed. Not at us. At something behind us. A deep dread curled in my stomach, and every part of me screamed not to turn around. I didn't want to see what she was pointing at, didn't want to confirm what I already knew was standing there. But some things are impossible to ignore. My breath caught as I turned and saw them. Figures moved between the trees, emerging from the mist like they had always been there, waiting for us to notice. Some looked like people, their shapes familiar, their faces half-formed shadows of something that had once been human. Others were wrong, too tall, their limbs stretched at angles, their heads tilting too far. Their fingers twitched in erratic movements, as if they were adjusting to wearing something that didn't belong to them. They were running. They were rushing forward. They simply walked, moving with the same slow, deliberate pace, the same unnatural patience. They knew we had nowhere to go. Ben exhaled sharply, his body trembling beside me. We have to, he started, but his words were swallowed by the sound of a new voice. Help. It came from somewhere ahead, from beyond the trees, desperate, gasping. My entire body went rigid. It was Carter. His voice was raw, strained, filled with panic. He was alive. He had to be. Ben turned to me, eyes wide with something close to relief. That's him, he said, his voice rising with urgency. He's close. We have to. No, I cut him off, my voice sharp, my heart pounding against my ribs. That's not him. Ben's expression twisted, something in him wanting to fight against what I was saying, wanting to believe that his sister could still be found, that Carter could still be saved. But deep down, he knew. The voice called again, this time closer, shifting, changing, smoothing out until it no longer sounded panicked. The urgency was gone, replaced by something calm. Daniel, it called, too measured, too practiced. It wasn't asking for help anymore. It was waiting. Ben took a shaky step back, and I grabbed his arm, forcing him forward, forcing him away from whatever was mimicking Carter's voice. We pushed through the trees, the air growing thicker, the forest warping around us as if it didn't want to let us go. Then, suddenly, a light flickered ahead, small, distant, barely cutting through the fog. It was a fire. Or a lantern. Or something else. I didn't stop to question it. I pulled Ben with me, running toward it, lungs burning, legs screaming for rest. The light got closer, brighter, real. And then, breaking through the tree line, we stumbled into a fire lookout tower. It shouldn't have been here. I had never seen it before. It wasn't on the park's maps. The metal frame stretched into the sky, rusted and swaying slightly with the wind. The stairs looked barely intact, the platform above dark and lifeless. But at that moment, I didn't care. It was high ground. It was shelter. It was our only option. I turned to Ben, breathless, my hands shaking. Up. Now. He hesitated, staring at the tower like it was a trap, like climbing it would only lead to something worse. I shoved him toward the steps, voice hard, desperate. Go. We climbed, the rusted metal groaning beneath our weight, the wind cutting sharp against my skin. Below us, the figures stood at the tree line, their heads tilted, their hollow eyes watching. They didn't follow. They didn't need to. Ben collapsed against the railing at the top, his breath ragged, his hands clutching his knees. I turned, scanning the landscape, looking for the path we had come from, for any sign of the ranger station, the trails, civilization. There was nothing. No roads. No trails. No way out. Just endless trees stretching in every direction. The wrongness of it settled deep in my chest, a weight pressing against my ribs, against my skull. We should have been able to see something. We should have been able to orient ourselves. But the world below was only forest. Ben made a choked noise beside me, his breath hitching, his body going rigid. I turned, following his gaze, and my stomach dropped. A red bandana sat in the center of the lookout floor, knotted and folded neatly. Next to it, placed carefully in the dust, was a radio. The same model Carter had carried. The same one he had dropped. It clicked to life. Through the static, a voice spoke. Not Carter's. Not Julia's. Something else. Something waiting. Daniel, it whispered. And below us, in perfect unison, every figure tilted their head and smiled. The radio crackled in my hand, the whisper curling out of the static like something alive. My name. Just my name. Soft, patient, almost amused. It knew I was listening. It knew I had nowhere to go. I couldn't move. My fingers clenched around the metal railing of the lookout tower, my pulse hammering against my ribs as I stared down at them. The figures stood in the trees below, their heads all tilted at the same impossible angle, their bodies motionless, waiting. The moonlight washed over them in fragments, catching the edges of their two long limbs, their hollow, empty eyes. Some of them still looked human. Others did not. Beside me, Ben was struggling to breathe, his hands gripping the edge of the platform so hard his knuckles had turned white. His gaze was locked on the red bandana and the radio sitting beside it. I knew what he was thinking. It wasn't ours. We had left the first bandana at the station, and the second one, the one we saw on the ground before taking this path, had disappeared. Now, somehow, it was here, neatly folded, waiting for us at the top of a tower that shouldn't exist. Ben's voice came out in a raw whisper. What do we do? I didn't know how to answer him. There was no plan, no logic, no rules for something like this. I had spent years navigating these woods, tracking missing people, solving cases that followed patterns. But this had no pattern. The radio crackled again. A shift, a breath, something just under the static. Then a voice, not whispering this time, not taunting. Daniel. It's me. I felt my stomach lurch, the voice sliding straight into my bones. It was Carter. Or at least, it sounded like him. The exhaustion, the fear, the strained rasp of someone who had been running for too long. I don't know where I am, the voice continued, crackling with static. I don't know how to get out. Ben whipped his head toward me, hope flickering in his eyes. That's him, he whispered. That's really him. I wanted to believe that. I really, really did. But I didn't. Something was wrong. I kept my grip on the radio but didn't respond. The figures below hadn't moved, but the longer I looked at them, the more I felt the wrongness creeping beneath my skin. They were watching us. Not really. They were waiting. The radio crackled again. Daniel. I swallowed hard. My throat was dry. I see you, Carter's voice said. I'm coming up. Every hair on my body stood on end. Ben took a step toward the stairs, eyes wide. He's here? No. No, he wasn't. The figures below had not moved. Not one of them had stepped toward the tower. And yet, somewhere beneath us, we heard the groan of metal steps. Someone was climbing up. Ben turned to me, his expression caught between fear and relief. What if it's really him? His voice was barely above a whisper, but I could hear the doubt creeping in. A new sound joined the static of the radio. Breathing. Slow, steady, too close to the receiver. The climb continued. One step. Then another. Then another. It wasn't fast. It wasn't rushing toward us. But it knew we were here. I gripped my gun, my pulse hammering in my ears. Ben backed away toward the far side of the platform, his hands shaking, his entire body tensed. The breathing on the radio deepened, almost thoughtful, like something was listening, like it was deciding what to say next. Then, too close, too clear, the voice on the radio said, "Open the door." There was no door. Ben let out a strangled sound, his whole body shaking now. His voice broke. We're trapped. I stepped forward, trying to steady my own breathing, my own panic. My mind was racing, trying to find a way out, but there was nothing. The figures in the trees hadn't moved, but I could feel them watching. They weren't climbing the tower. They didn't need to, because something else was. The metal steps groaned again, closer now, and then silence. The climbing had stopped. It was just beneath the platform. A long, stretching moment passed, thick with the weight of something unnatural pressing against my skin. Then, slowly, fingers curled over the edge of the railing. Then made a choked sound, stumbling backward. My grip on the gun tightened. The hand didn't pull itself up. Not yet. It just rested there. The knuckles were wrong. Too sharp. The bones pressed against the skin like they had been arranged beneath it by something unfamiliar with human anatomy. The fingers twitched once, like they were getting used to being a hand. Then it smiled. Not with a mouth. With another hand. The fingers split out against the railing and curled inward, flexing in perfect synchronization, forming the shape of teeth. Ben broke first. He lunged back toward the stairs, and the moment he moved, it reacted. The fingers slipped away from the railing, and the groan of metal came fast. Too fast. Whatever was beneath us was climbing. Ben made it to the stairs before I could stop him. "Ben, wait," I shouted, but he was already moving, already scrambling down, desperate for any escape. I turned, gun raised, heart pounding, but I didn't know where to aim. The steps screamed under the weight of whatever was coming, and for the first time, the figures below moved. They didn't climb. They didn't have to. Because the forest had just shifted again. The lookout tower, the one that had seemed so tall, so distant from the ground, was suddenly lower than before. The trees that had been so far away had stretched closer, their trunks pressing inward like the forest had shrunk the space around us. The figures reached up. Not with their arms. With their smiles. The ones that had too many teeth, the ones that had no faces at all, the ones that knew we had nowhere else to go. And below me, I heard Ben scream. Then the whistling came again, louder than ever, surrounding us from every direction. The forest had us now. And it was never letting go. Ben's scream cut through the trees, a sharp, desperate sound that barely lasted a second before it was swallowed by the thick, waiting silence. I turned just in time to see him rushing down the rusted stairs, his footing unsure, his body leaning forward in full panic. He wasn't thinking, wasn't planning. He was fleeing, reacting on instinct, and I knew in that instant that it was exactly what they wanted. The figures in the trees had been waiting for this moment, for one of us to break, and the second Ben's foot hit the third step, they moved. It wasn't like before. They didn't walk. They didn't climb. They simply shifted. One moment they were standing at the tree line, still and distant. The next, they were closer, impossibly so, as if the space between us had collapsed in a blink. Ben didn't notice, his focus was locked on the steps, on his desperate attempt to get away, but I did. I saw how their limbs moved at odd angles, how some of them weren't touching the ground, how one of them had no eyes, only a stretched mouth curling into something that wasn't quite a grin. The rawness of it twisted in my gut, the silent confirmation that Ben was already too late. His boots slipped against rusted metal, his balance shifting, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the railing to keep himself from falling. The tower groaned beneath him, the entire structure vibrating as if something else, something unseen, was pressing against it. He turned back toward me then, his eyes wide, filled with terror. "Daniel, help me." His voice cracked, the weight of it crashing into my chest, but even as I moved forward, I knew I wouldn't be fast enough. Because it was already behind him. The thing that had followed us, the one that had whispered my name through the radio, the one that had used Carter's voice, had climbed up beneath the platform while we were distracted. I saw its hand first, if you could call it that. The fingers were bent at unnatural angles, too many joints, too many sharp edges, as if whatever was inside had rearranged itself incorrectly, trying to mimic what a hand should look like. Ben didn't see it. But I did. I saw it reach. I saw it touch the back of his shoulder. And then, Ben was gone. Not pulled. Not yanked. Not dragged screaming into the trees. Just gone. 1 second he was there. The next, the steps were empty. The air collapsed inward, a shift so unnatural that my stomach twisted with the rawness of it. It was as if the space where he had been rewritten, as if he had never existed at all. The trees groaned in response, their trunks shifting, and below me, every figure tilted their head in perfect unison. Then, they smiled. The breath caught in my throat, my head spinning, my body struggling to process what had just happened. The tower creaked beneath me, metal straining as the wind howled through the trees, though it wasn't real wind, it was something else. A soundless pressure pushing against my skin, pressing into my skull. And then I realized something. I was still holding the radio. I didn't remember grabbing it. Didn't remember pressing the button. But somehow, I was speaking. Ben? The static that came through was instant. Louder than before. Not empty. Not white noise. There were voices in it. 100 overlapping whispers, curling, twisting, never fully forming words, but I could feel them, pressing in on my ears, pushing their way inside. I tried to pull away, tried to let go, but my fingers wouldn't move. The static deepened, shifting into something that felt alive, crawling through my head, wrapping itself around my thoughts. Then, between the whispers, a voice came through. Not Carter's. Not Ben's. Not mine. Something else. You should have left. The wind roared. The figures below moved. The tower tilted. I stumbled back, my legs nearly giving out as the entire platform lurched beneath me. My body screamed to collapse, to shut down, to let go, to give in. But I couldn't. There was only one way out. One chance. I turned, lungs burning, heart slamming against my ribs, and jumped. The air slammed into me, branches ripping at my arms, my face, my legs. The world spun, a blur of darkness and shattered sky, and then impact. Pain exploded through my ribs, my shoulder hitting the ground hard, a crack of bone against earth. The forest swallowed me whole. I woke up in the dirt. The silence was the first thing I noticed. Not the silence of an empty forest. The silence of something listening. My limbs were heavy, my body no longer my own, as if I had been gone for longer than I realized. The trees above me were unfamiliar, stretching endlessly into the sky, their twisted branches curling in directions that made my head ache just to look at. I didn't move. I just lay there, staring up, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the forest to finish me. But nothing did. The figures were gone. The tower was gone. The watchers had disappeared. I was alone. Or at least, that's what I thought, until I saw the bandana. It was sitting in the dirt beside me, folded, untouched. Red. Waiting. And next to it, placed carefully as if someone had set it there just for me, was the radio. I reached for it slowly, my fingers trembling, the plastic warm beneath my touch, almost pulsing. My breath shuddered as I lifted it, my thumb hovering over the button. I should have left it. I should have gotten up, walked away, never looked back. But I didn't. I clicked it on. Static flooded the speaker. Then, a voice. Daniel? Every muscle in my body went rigid, my breath freezing in my chest. It was Ben. He sounded close. Too close. Like he was standing just behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the trees, the weight of the radio heavy in my hands. Then, in the distance, a whistle. 3 notes. And I knew. The forest had let me go. But only because it had something better now. And someday, when it was ready, it would come back for me, too.